Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Major General Larry Stutzring, U.S. Air Force retired and Director of Research here at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Welcome to our Nuclear Deterrence Forum. We're very fortunate to have with us today Dr. David Albright. Mr. Albright is the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security. The projects on which he focuses bring greater transparency of nuclear activities worldwide and strengthen the international non-proliferation regime. David is an accomplished writer on non-proliferation and other nuclear topics. You most likely have seen him in the media. He appears quite frequently as the go-to expert on nuclear weapons programs in places such as Iraq and North Korea. Prior to founding the Institute, Mr. Albright was a senior staff scientist at the Federation of American Scientists and cooperated closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency Action Team. Well, welcome, David. It's certainly a privilege to talk to you today. It's a privilege for me personally. Thank you for taking the time. You bet.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and have this opportunity to talk about Iran. Iran certainly remains one of America's most challenging adversaries. Its nuclear weapons ambitions alone threaten the range of our interests in the region and increase the risk of nuclear proliferation. At its best, the nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, was not expected to settle the nuclear question because of its sunsets on nuclear limitations and inadequate verification arrangements over potential and actual military nuclear activities. The Trump administration decided, against the advice of most, to end its participation in the nuclear deal in May 2018 and reimpose US sanctions. Part of the motivation to act then, rather than wait, was twofold. First, the agreement cannot address whether Iran is merely biding its time in its quest for nuclear weapons, patiently building up its nuclear weapons capabilities under the cover and legitimacy of the deal. Second, the agreement resulted in locking up all major US economic and financial sanctions in a sense in a cabinet, even those needed against Iranian terrorist and missile activities. The reimposition of US sanctions has worked more effectively than anyone expected, devastating Iran's economy, weakening the country militarily, and making it harder for Iran to engage in adventures in the region. The administration hoped that Iran would not rebuild its nuclear capabilities rolled back by the JCPOA, and they were extensive. In a sense, the administration wanted to have its cake and eat it too, and this was wishful thinking. Iran waited about a year and then started rebuilding its nuclear capability, particularly in its gas centrifuge program, its most dangerous nuclear program. And a measure of that buildup is given by what we call breakout. And the way at my institute we use breakout is it's the time to produce enough weapon-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon, which we take as about 25 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium. And it's not the time to build the weapon itself, and I'll come back to that a little later, and we'll discuss that, I'm sure, in the question period. But it is a measure of the progress in the build back of their program. And as of September, we estimated that they could produce that 25 kilograms, enough for a bomb, in about 3.5 months. Now, our estimates are designed to give you the shortest time. I mean, it certainly can be longer, and Iran has been notorious for having failed centrifuges and bungling up its ability to produce enriched uranium, but we don't think it'll be shorter than that in this present time. An oft overlooked sunset of the nuclear deal is in UN Security Council Resolution 2231, a conventional arms embargo that expires this month. The administration has, from its earliest days, worried about the ending of this embargo as a major threat to the region. This motivated an unusual move by the United States, namely to seek a snapback of all sanctions via the JCPOA process embedded in Resolution 2231, which listed the US as a participant under the resolution. And Snapback, to remind people, is something that will happen regardless of what the UN Security Council would try to do. The Council cannot stop the snapback process once invoked, and the US says it has now done so. Other participants, namely our European allies, Russia and China, deny that the US can do this. However, the language in Resolution 2231 about what a participant is vague. It's a problem in many vague clauses in the nuclear deal and the associated Resolution 2231. So the result is both sides have room for legal interpretation. The outcome will have to await the presidential election. From administration point of view, however, it has now more running room to impose sanctions on Iran and those that refuse to snap back. The JCPOA consciously never settled the question of whether Iran, on its implementation day in January 2016, had an ongoing nuclear weapons program. Instead, it kicked this key issue to the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, which showed little appetite to take on Iran on this issue and potentially disrupt the nuclear deal. The IAEA was not willing to press Iran to open up its military sites to inspections, allow access to key personnel that they could interview, and actually answer the inspectors' questions truthfully. Instead, the IAEA slowly worked on this issue at its margins, and to its credit, every 3 months in its report stated that it could not determine or certify Iran's nuclear program as peaceful. Type of, or maybe even, let me just call it a black swan, happened in early 2018, before the US actually ended its participation in the nuclear deal. Israel successfully seized a large cache of top secret Iranian documents and CDs in Tehran about what's called Plan Ahmad, which, upon investigation of those documents, revealed a crash nuclear weapons program that existed in the early 2000s with a goal to build 5 nuclear weapons, 4 of which would be missile deliverable on the Shahid-3 missile, and 1 would be prepared for an underground nuclear test if a decision was made to test. Importantly and inadvertently, international pressure in 2003 led to Iran canceling the Ahmad plan, walking back its program. However, the documents in the archive also show Iran did not end its nuclear weapons program. Instead, it downsized it and reconstituted. The documents also show a nuclear weapons program that was far larger and more advanced than thought before the discovery. Not everything was known, as unfortunately was often claimed by the strongest proponents of the nuclear deal. There's much new about the nuclear weapons program in the archives, including sites that were not known about and progress not understood before. Israel made a strategic decision to share the archive broadly. It recognized that there are highly classified documents in the archive. I've had the fortune to have seen the archive twice and to the Institute translated many of the documents ourselves. But again, with the caveat that we're an unclassified program and we don't have access to what is a rich vein of nuclear weapons sensitive information. But Israel made the decision to give the entire set to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this possession of this archive eventually knocked the IAEA out of its slumber. Based on documents in the archive and its own investigations, it has pressed Iran for access to 2 sites that are listed in the Ahmad plan and were not known before, at least their locations. One was a dismantled pilot uranium conversion facility that was in the Ahmad plan's fuel cycle complex, which incidentally included the Fordow enrichment plant. That was being built in the early 2000s to make weapon-grade uranium for nuclear weapons under the Ahmad plan. The other site was a critical nuclear weapons component testing site in a remote part of Iran called Marivan. While this site was known about from previous intelligence, its location was not known. And after months of refusing the IAEA's requests, Iran recently agreed to allow IAEA access to these 2 sites. However, Iran's decision was likely tactical, a way to deflect international pressure and further split the US from Europe. It did not represent a desire to truly cooperate with the IAEA. It routinely calls the archive documents forgeries. The second visit just happened, and the results of those visits will come in after the election. But the archive has already challenged that Iran's nuclear program is entirely peaceful. Iran's preservation of the archive, and it's a well-kept archive. That preservation by itself casts serious doubts on whether that program is peaceful. And this issue should be front and center in any re-engagement with Iran. Now, what does an Iranian nuclear weapons program look like today? The documents in the archive say the program continued, albeit in a downsized and reconstituted way. I think in our own analysis, we don't look for a program today that is building nuclear weapons. We look for a different type of nuclear weapons program, a program in a sense to be prepared to build nuclear weapons. And it's instructive to look at how does Iran define a nuclear weapon? First of all, it requires nuclear explosive material. Weapon-grade uranium is its material of choice. It started to explore plutonium, but at the same time, it realized that plutonium was not going to be a real option for at least a decade, and is still not a real option. Weaponization is critical, but it's one of the pillars of the nuclear weapons program. And it's a program under a mod that was headed by Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. He continues to head successor organizations to the Ahmad Plan, concentrated on all these capabilities associated with nuclear weapons. Over time, that organization has grown into an entity that can be likened to DARPA, where part of it appears to be focused on maintaining and advancing nuclear weapons, weaponization capabilities, but has broadened itself into a DARPA-like organization. And the third that's critical is ballistic missiles. Integration of a warhead into a Shahid-3 missile was intrinsic to the program from the beginning, and a great deal of effort in Ahmad was spent on that. Now, all three of these pillars exist today. Fissile material now is controlled under the Atomic Energy Organization, not explicitly the military, although the Atomic Energy Organization is not truly a civil entity in the way we would think about it in the United States. Weaponization continues under a DARPA-like organization, and ballistic missiles have continued and the program has grown dramatically. Now, we use the example of Taiwan as a model. Taiwan had a nuclear weapons program that grew quite dramatically in the 1980s, but it was a program, again, to be prepared. Taiwan consciously decided that it wanted a program that, if ordered by the leadership, could produce a deliverable nuclear weapon in 3 to 6 months. And deliverability for Taiwan meant an advanced aircraft that they were developing indigenously, although a great deal of US components. And they felt motivated to do this by a calculation they made in the 1980s of how long could they resist a Chinese invasion. And so, again, it was not a latent program. It was a program that somehow, if they had the ability to, in this case, produce and separate plutonium, that they could decide to build a weapon. It was an active program. And we think Iran is doing the same thing, that it's a similar. What we don't know is whether Iran has sat down and said, we want to be able to produce a nuclear weapon if called upon in a certain number of months. I mean, if I don't think they could do it in 3 to 6 months. Breakout that we estimate is really the fissile material only, and they would have to integrate a warhead into a missile. The Ahmad Plan shows they didn't finish, the documents in the archive show that they didn't finish the integration work. Certainly they've done some since, although our guess right now is that they still aren't quite finished. They probably could cobble together a device for an underground test pretty quickly. They had gone far in siting an underground test site, and we don't have any sense that that work completely halted. They certainly stopped the process of picking an underground test site and drilling the shaft, but we think they've maintained their capabilities. But again, less than a year, if they decided today, they could probably test underground, probably considerably less than a year. And overall, the archive has shown that Iran is not far from being able to build deliverable nuclear weapons. And the Iran nuclear challenge could not be solved by the JCPOA, and the Trump administration has not solved it yet. And let me just end, it is a challenge begging attention, and thank you very much.
Thanks, David. There's so many nuggets in what you just said. I've got 3 or 4 that stand out just to go a little deeper into. And the obvious one is JCPOA, and I was involved in some critique of that before and after the fact. In your opinion, what was effective in the Iran deal? Was there anything effective? Did it curtail Iran's or slow down Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability?
Yeah, I think that was very important accomplishments in the JCPOA. I mean, it rolled back their centrifuge program and stopped their development of advanced centrifuges. I also think it led them to get nervous about the weaponization. I mean, the Israelis will tell you how there was a decision to consolidate the secret documents from the Ahmad plan, to gather them up and consolidate them. And then they also at one point moved them. And so I think it put Iran back on its heels. There's no doubt about that. And I think that part of the JCPOA was important. Where it had problems was the sunsets were too short. I mean, I can remember sitting in workshops with people who became key negotiators of the JCPOA back in 2013. And there was an optimism that these sunsets would be 20 to 30 years. Certainly Iran, it was known by then, wanted 5 to 10. But the US position was 20 to 30. And they felt they could get that. In the end, they're closer to 10 to 15. And in that 10 to 15 period, Iran can build back dramatically its gas centrifuge program and also have it legitimized. And the other problem was Iran made a red line clear in the beginning: no access to military sites by the IAEA. And well, that's where the bad stuff happens, is at military sites. And the Ahmad plan has shown that over and over again, that that's where they did their work on nuclear weapons. And they did that work at many military sites. And by creating that red line, they also crippled the IAEA's ability, or accepting that red line, they crippled the IAEA's ability to really get to the bottom of this. And I think the IAEA took the message and crippled itself as a result for a couple of years. And the archive, in a sense, is a saving grace. But the dynamic in the JCPOA that was supposed to solve this problem, namely snapback, was too onerous. The IAEA didn't want to push this issue, and others didn't want the IAEA to push it because it would collapse the deal. That if you ask for access, demand access, good justification, then boom, you've collapsed the deal because the only option is snapback.
So in other words, the approach was, at least we can see and survey some, knowing we can't get to where we want to go, but we want to get there. We want to be able to see something. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, and I think it's something, the JCPOA is something to build on. And there was an effort in the administration, what we called fix the deal. And that was rejected in the end, but it was to take these flaws and then try to create a structure to renegotiate the deal in the sort of the short term. But that decision was ended, or that path was ended by the May 2018 withdrawal.
Well, let's pick that path back up, you and me, and I'm curious, if you were writing a new JCPOA or some other instrument moving forward, how would it look? I mean, what would be key features of that? Can you give us your opinion?
Yeah, one is that I think this question, is Iran's program peaceful or not, has to be settled up front. It has to be part of the conditions of an implementation of a new deal. I think it's too troubling and too destabilizing to not know if they're intending to build nuclear weapons in the future, or keeping that capability alive and actually improving that capability. So that's number one. The second is, my position has evolved on this, is that I was fully happy to accept the limited centrifuge program that's embedded in the JCPOA. I mean, we worked out the idea of breakout starting in 2010, and we're happy the administration took it on board. I mean, they worked on it too, obviously. I don't want to claim credit for breakout, but we were happy that they took it on board and used it to guide the limits. Since then, I've watched the Iranian centrifuge program in more detail because they did have to reveal more to the IA. It's a hopelessly uneconomic program. It's a program that'll never produce enriched uranium cheaper than Iran could buy it overseas. And I think it would be irresponsible to legitimize such a program through a new deal. And so I've evolved that I think it's best that there be no enrichment program in Iran, and that be the US goal. If you can't get that, then the sunsets have to be 20, 30 years so that Iran would be incentivized to move away from its gas centrifuge program. And then, of course, the missiles. The missiles have to be included. In the fixed strategy, the kind of the critical one was Iran has to be blocked from developing an ICBM. Our allies wanted shorter range missiles covered, but clearly a nuclear weapon in real terms doesn't exist without an Iranian ballistic missile. And if you don't limit those, then you haven't limited a key aspect or a key pillar of Iran's nuclear weapons program.
Well, I'll ask you more about that. I am curious about the ballistic missile program, but let's just one more thread I want to pull on that nuclear archive. You know, that seizure certainly shed new light as you described. Could you go further into that? Was there a lot of new revelation from that archive? And I realize we're both in unclassified organizations, but was there a lot of new light that wasn't understood by the intelligence community, in your opinion, from what you understand?
Yeah, I think there were several surprises. I mentioned the facilities. I mean, the two that the IA wants to inspect, Maravan, and we call it the Tehran Plant, that was involved in pilot uranium conversion activities. They were not known about in terms of where they were. The IA and the intelligence community knew about some experiments in Maravan, but didn't know the location. The archive shows there were several of those kinds of experiments and provides the details of what happened in those experiments. So you have much greater depth of knowledge about the types of nuclear weapons program that Iran was developing. There was a site called Shahid Bourgeri, which was not known. I mean, and again, I'm not talking to US intelligence. They've tended to keep the archive fairly confidential. But in talking to, particularly Israelis, they didn't know about the Shahid Bourgeri site before they saw it in the archive. We all knew where it was. I mean, you could see it at the Parchin military complex. We had assessed it in 2004 as being there, but we didn't know what it was. We didn't think it was nuclear. It was actually being built under the Ahmad Plan to make the cores of nuclear weapons, to produce uranium, weapon-grade uranium metal, and shape the cores, and it was a production scale facility. It was one of the ones that Iran decided to actually shut down when it closed out the Ahmad Plan. I mean, they also shut down a facility they were going to build on assembling nuclear weapons. And so the production side of this crash program did truly end. And it ended under international pressure. I want to emphasize that. Iran is vulnerable to international pressure. And that's important. Another surprise, and this is mostly from the Israelis, because we're not allowed into those documents, although I certainly can see it in what we've received on an unclassified basis, that Iran developed a nuclear weapons program that was quite sophisticated in terms of understanding how nuclear weapons work and how do you build them. So in a sense, their computer simulation capabilities, their theoretical knowledge, their ability to design a nuclear weapon, that it wasn't just a copy. They certainly got nuclear weapons designs, I mean, through the AQ-Con network, for example. And there may have been some input from that into the design. They received help from at least one and probably more ex-Soviet nuclear weapons experts. There's an interesting line item budget in one of their documents planning for the next 4 years of expenditures on nuclear weapons. You know, it says foreign experts. It doesn't say foreign expert, but experts. And so I think their program was more advanced, it was more comprehensive, and it puts them in a much better position to build nuclear weapons today.
Yes. Well, let me move to the sanctions and explore that quickly. We've seen under that maximum pressure campaign, we've reimposed those sanctions against Iran, and it's affected currency, and so forth. But has it had an impact, in your opinion, on anything within the Iranian enrichment program or other aspects of its nuclear ambitions?
Yeah, it's very hard to use sanctions to block an Iranian buildup of its nuclear program. In many cases, what they're doing is just restarting centrifuges, putting in ones that they had taken apart and stored. I mean, they carefully stored many of their centrifuges under the deal. They weren't required to destroy them. And so the sanctions can't really affect that. Where the sanctions certainly can affect them is their goal to build a large-scale program. I mean, they've got to import a lot of equipment. It's not an indigenous program. I mean, they can make centrifuges, but often the raw materials, the equipment to make things, some of the information comes from overseas. And it's illegal for Iran to acquire those items. And so they have to smuggle them or otherwise acquire them. And that can be certainly disrupted. Those efforts can be disrupted by the sanctions efforts. Companies are much more aware. They don't want to do business with Iran. They don't want to risk US sanctions because they may do so inadvertently. So I think Iran's buildup in the long run is deeply threatened by US sanctions.
But we also have in Europe, of course, some key allies who are not quite on board. Secretary Pompeo has, made a number of comments about that. What actions is the United States going to take or should take, in your opinion, to keep the allies together on this if they can? It may not be even feasible, and secondly, how do you see Tehran exploiting that daylight between the United States and its allies on these sanctions?
Yeah, well, I mean, Iran's active every day to exploit the slits. I mean, I think that's why they agreed to allow access to these military sites associated with the mod. I mean, it was right when the U.S. was trying to build a pressure for countries to join it in its snapback effort, and it was popped the balloon in a sense of the pressure building on IA access. And so I think they're at it every day. Zarif is, to me, he's like the Tariq Aziz of Iran. Wow. And he's out there spinning stuff, trying to create divisions, get the US NGOs fighting among themselves, get governments fighting. I mean, he's just a fount of misinformation and disinformation and actively working to weaken resolve and magnify splits. I mean, that's his job. And so I think that's ongoing. Now, about the first question, what can we do? Now, Iran, particularly the E3, did join the effort to try to fix the deal. And they came very far. I mean, I reviewed some of the drafts. They recognized the inspection effort had to be fixed. There was no doubt. They saw the weaknesses in it. They struggled with the sunsets. They're much more legalistic than we are. But they did come quite far. And I think there's a certain hesitancy now based on that experience where the administration just walked away from this in May 2018, very far in that process. They feel that they want to wait for a new administration. If President Trump is elected, I think they will probably come to terms with what's happened. They see that the deal's been hollowed out. I mean, they're not into supporting arms control agreements where the parties are violating it like mad. They understand the absurdity of that and the danger of that. But I think they want to wait and see if Joe Biden wins the presidency and see if there's a restart to this whole thing, because they ultimately would like to see a fixed JCPOA in place. Now, I don't think they can lead. I'm sorry. I spend much of my year in Europe. They're incapable of leading. And I think if there are problems, I think it does make sense that if they're not enforcing the sanctions as we see, I think it makes sense to sanction some European entities. I mean, I wouldn't go too far on that, but I think some shots across the bow may make sense, and make the Europeans understand that we can't continue down this path where Iran just openly violates, tries to acquire things illicitly, and not see more enforcement from the Europeans. I mean, European companies do not want to do business with Iran. I mean, they got the message. I mean, the governments have been a little recalcitrant.
Right. Well, let me move back to your 3.5-month estimate. You recently analyzed the IAEA's verification and monitoring report. How do we arrive at that 3.5-month estimate? Can you kind of share with us?
Sure. Yeah. No. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, although we have to use quite a bit of, I don't want to call it inside information, but information about the Iranian centrifuge program. I mean, we know what they're building because it came originally from Pakistan with the IR-1 centrifuge. There was something called the IR-2 centrifuge, which they modified and is the basis for all their advanced centrifuges. We know the cascade structures, which are where you collect the centrifuges together with piping and put in uranium and then enrich it. We know how much low enriched uranium they have, because if you can feed in low enriched uranium into a cascade, you'll get to a higher level. And we know from the Pakistani data, and we know Iran got it, that the way they think about making weapon grade uranium in Pakistan, and Iranians have talked about this themselves, is you go in stages from natural to 3 to 4 or 5%. Then you go in another stage from that to 20%, from 20% to 60, 60% to 90, which is the weapon grade uranium. So you have 4 steps. And so we know that that's probably how they would do breakout. And that creates what are called inefficiencies. And that's really part of this calculation is that if you do a straight kind of normal, that's often done in public calculation of breakout, you'll get times that are probably half of ours. And so the key thing we found is how do you build in the inefficiencies? And so this idea of staging leads to one. We have other inefficiencies we've seen from the operation of the cascades over years that add in additional inefficiencies. Frankly, the machines break. I think their breakage rate, demonstrated breakage rate now is almost 15% a year, which means 15% of the centrifuges break every year and have to be replaced. Well, when they break, that causes disruptions in the enrichment process. Their breakage rates in the past have often exceeded 20% per year. So it's not a well-run program based on let's say European centrifuge standards, which ultimately that's where Pakistan got its centrifuges, stole them. The last thing is, and this is where we've had a difference with the US government, is Iran took out 1,000 what are called IR-2M centrifuges under the JCPOA and stored them. We think in a breakout, they would reinstall those right away. The US government has taken the position, no, they wouldn't. We thought that's wrong. And in debates I've had with senior DOE officials, with other administration officials, they don't have an argument to me of why Iran wouldn't deploy its most advanced centrifuges in a breakout today. And in fact, they have been redeploying IR-2Ms under their recent buildup. So I think if you add that in, that brings it down by a month or 2 from what you would get if you didn't redeploy the IR-2Ms. And so, and this is a fairly transparent calculation, and you end up with a number that gives you the breakout. And again, the experience of Iran is that things can go wrong, and they often do. And so we think that it should be carefully articulated as this is the sort of shortest time we think possible right now. and it could be longer.
Well, I have to move to the operational view that we're always interested in. I'll share with you that I participated in a war game just before I retired a few years ago. And we had some pretty powerful, talented people who had served both in uniform and out of uniform in the AOR there in the Middle East. And at the end of that play, which was a scenario where Iran had nuclear capability, limited inventory of nuclear tipped missiles, was 5 years in the future. And the end result of that was one statement, which is by the entire group in unity, was that this can't happen. They can't have this capability. It's too difficult from a military point of view to deal with. So what about that full up capability, not just the ability to develop the warhead, but to integrate it and a ballistic technology to deliver it? What's that breakout time to full system capability, and how quickly, how far, I should say, what geography would they be able to reach in a near term?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, it's really, and I don't think the archive can fully answer it. I mean, one of the interesting things about the reconstitution documents is that they're very, very detailed, discuss what they want to preserve, where they're at in that, what they have to do. And you get a deeper insight into that they weren't there yet on integrating a warhead into a ballistic missile. They had additional work to do. What's very difficult now is to say, well, how much work have they done in the last 15 years? It's a very difficult question. And you get a range of estimates. I mean, I've had senior French political officials in the foreign ministry, and even backed up by some in the Atomic Energy Commission, 3 months, Iran could build the bomb and probably weaponize it. I mean, I think they say that more for effect than anything else. But if you add that to fissile material, you're talking at least 6 months. Other estimates, and I think even the Israeli estimates are more than a year for a ballistic missile that carries a warhead. And I think you have to look at it too, if you compare it to North Korea. I mean, this thing has to be reliable. I mean, of course, they could cobble something together quickly, strap it into a reentry vehicle, fire it, but it'll almost with certainty fail. And so they have to have confidence that this thing's going to work. And I think that's you have to factor that into this. And I think that adds some time. So, a year or two, I think, is not unreasonable. But we don't know. And that's partly why any new deal has got to wrestle with this question. And we've got to understand just where are they and have assurance that they're not further developing their integration capabilities in some secret program at a site that the IAC is not allowed to visit in practical terms.
Yeah. And the ballistic missiles, of course, as you said in your opening comments, were left out of JCPOA. So that development's proceeded, of course. We see that. Do you have any perspectives on that?
Yeah, I think I don't know. It seems it even gets back to this national intelligence assessment where, that Iran in 2007 it was assessed that Iran ended its nuclear weapons program, but the nuclear weapons program is defined too narrowly and in a way too kind of rigidly. They don't work like this in the real world, and I think it led to a mistake to not include this integration side of things, and a demand, in essence, from the negotiators, U.S. negotiators, and I'm sure the French would have backed this up. These questions have to be settled before implementation date. And the IA needs to go to a set number of sites and gain assurance that these activities don't continue. And it could have been done, but there was a decision not to do it.
Yeah, interesting. You've written several pieces on the damage to that Iranian centrifuge assembly center at Natanz, and what are the implications of those explosions at Natanz, as well as I guess it was Koger missile production and development complex?
Yeah, on the missile complex, we didn't see any damage to the core part of the site. It seemed to be in some fuel tanks or compressed gas tanks. Natanz, there was real damage. And I don't want to sound cynical, but in a way, this Iran Centrifuge Assembly Center was a loophole in the JCPOA. It was being built as a very large scale facility to assemble thousands of centrifuges a year, advanced centrifuges a year. And it just probably should have been shut down, but it was sort of in a way frozen. And but construction continued on it. And its destruction certainly sets back the program. I mean, under the JCPOA, they did have to concentrate their nuclear activities, centrifuge activities at Natanz. And so they had to give up some of their activities elsewhere. And so in terms of large scale production of advanced centrifuges, this was it. So they certainly can still assemble advanced centrifuges and deploy them on probably a scale of tens, maybe even after a while, hundreds, but enough in a sense for a research and development program and a nuclear weapons program. But their effort to build large numbers of these, to really scale up to the goal of their program of 10,000, 20,000 centrifuges operating at Natanz, and in particular, those are on hold for a while. And this explosion at the site really did destroy the complex. I would imagine even most of the equipment in the building was destroyed. Yeah. But that didn't stop the Iranians. I mean, if I can just add, I mean, we just released a study yesterday following an Iranian announcement that they're going to build a new site, but this time in the mountains near Natanz. And we looked in those mountains back in 2007 because they were building a tunnel complex associated with Natanz, which I don't think at the time they wouldn't have let the IAEA inspect. Other tunnel complexes associated with nuclear sites, for example, at the Esfahan uranium conversion site, they let the IAEA inspect, and they were tied to the nuclear site. This one, I'm not sure. Certainly at the time they didn't allow the inspection. But the study looks at, is there construction activity, and it appears to be very preparatory in nature. It's all we could find. And it reinforces this idea that they probably won't be able to replace this site in the near term, probably not in 2021, but they intend to do it. And again, it raises this issue of how does the U.S. Think through a large-scale centrifuge program in Iran, and when it's incredibly uneconomic, and certainly from my point of view is that a large-scale program would be a perfect place to hide a breakout, because you could reduce breakout times to days, if not hours, based on if Iran builds the kind of large-scale plant the supreme leaders talked about publicly.
Well, it's interesting. Iran downplayed those explosions, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and I thought there is a constraint being exercised by both sides within some pretty stark actions by each side. I think Iran was worried if it retaliated, and retaliation could easily have followed at that moment. This site's been blown up by our enemy, Israel. There are all kinds of demands internal to the regime to retaliate. If they had, maybe Iran would have lost the Fordow site. And I think some of them even talked about that there was a trap here. And I think that they knew and recognized that going forth too quickly with the demands for retaliation, which would certainly follow a clear statement of what happened, were risky for Iran. And I think that's why they hesitated.
David, we've got to talk about North Korea. And early last year, you outlined 6 key principles that should underpin a policy that would convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons program. Can you explain your thinking, lay that out for us quickly, and is it feasible?
Yeah, what it is you want to, the idea in North Korea has always been denuclearization. That's been the goal. There's been intermediate deals like the Agreed Framework, 6-party talks, but the goal has always been denuclearization, that we can't live with a North Korean nuclear weapons program. And so in North Korea, it was no more feasible than it would have been in Taiwan in 1985 or South Africa in 1987. So I mean, some of this is you have to look at it in the change that happens within regimes that will suddenly decide to go for denuclearization. They'll see it in their benefit. But I think if you just look at it country, you probably always say, it's not feasible. But it's happened. And that's been the goal in North Korea all along and still remains the goal. And I think it's probably going to remain the goal of South Korea, Japan, and the United States. You may want to have intermediate deals, as we've had in the past, but that is the goal. And now, what does denuclearization require? One is we have to know what they have. And the biggest stumbling block in North Korea has always been they don't want to reveal what they have. And I'm not talking about the number of nuclear weapons. I'm not talking about where they store nuclear weapons. I'm talking about how much plutonium and weapon-grade uranium can they make? Where do they make it? What's their fuel cycle to support that? And they've always resisted an accurate portrayal of that. And that's the biggest problem in this. But it's also, it has to happen. I mean, we know that from many countries that if you don't know what's out there, you can't get rid of it, and you certainly can't verify it, and you can't even evaluate an interim deal. Iran is a good example. The US in its pre-negotiation with Iran, leading up to the Joint Plan of Action in late 2013, had to assess, does Iran have secret enrichment plants? Because Iran had said, we're going to build 10 of them. This was after the discovery of the secret Fordow site. Their response was, we're going to build 10 of them. And they said, well, we've started. And so the US had to establish, to the best of it could, there were no secret enrichment plants out there under construction. Because if there were, then anything that happened after that would be completely meaningless. If I can put it back in the North Korean context, people always talk about ending activities at the Yongbyon site. Fine. But if North Korea has an enrichment program that's outside of Yongbyon, how good is an agreement that stops the production of 1, 2, 3 nuclear weapons a year at Yongbyon by limiting the production of plutonium and weapon-grade uranium, that if North Korea can make 1, 2, 5, 6, 7 nuclear weapons based on a secret site we don't even know about. So you do have to balance these things, and in it you need a declaration up front, and that's where the process really broke down between President Trump and Kim Jong-un.
Well, David Albright, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time on this segment. I want to thank you for being with us today. Once again, it's a privilege for me personally and for Mitchell Institute. Hope to see you again soon. You bet. On behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Space Studies, we wish you the very best. As a reminder to our listeners, our next event will be on Wednesday, October 16th, when we'll host Lieutenant General B. Chance Saltzman on our Space Power Forum. He's Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Operations Cyber and Nuclear, United States Space Force, currently stationed at the Pentagon. We're now going to open the session to questions from the audience, David, and they've been listening to your conversation, our conversation. As a reminder to our listeners, you can participate using the Q&A function. You can use the raise hand function. I just ask you when you are called upon, please unmute your mic, state who you are, where you're from, for our guest. And if it's a question that you've sent in, I'll read it to Mr. Albright. Okay, David, this one comes from Daniel Rice. He says, North Korea is expected to showcase its ballistic missile inventory in a military parade this weekend, including some of its newest and biggest missiles. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, you always have to, well, I mean, I'm an analyst, anxious to see them. I mean, like to see if there's something new there that adds some insight into their nuclear weapons effort, because it's, you know, North Korea makes bold claims, 2-stage thermonuclear weapons. It's demonstrated a weapon that well over 100 kilotons. So it's obviously doing something thermonuclear. And so it'd be interesting to see. Now, I don't expect much on the nuclear. I mean, there may be claims, but we're still in a quandary over basic things. How do they use weapon-grade uranium and nuclear weapons? I don't think anyone's established that in a concrete way, proof that they do, like proof's been established they use plutonium. We don't know on thermonuclear, they kind of using the old style, thermonuclear, very old style of kind of, I call it a one stage, where you do kind of a layering of plutonium and weapon-grade uranium and lithium deuteride shells and more weapon-grade uranium. And you could, I think there was a British unclassified design where they ended up with lots of lithium deuteride and 100 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium in this big spherical mass that reached 300-400 kilotons. So, is that the kind of bomb North Korea is developing? I mean, not very deliverable by a missile. But we don't know. And so you look in these parades for any information that can add some deeper knowledge of what they've got. And can they really deliver a warhead to the United States? Is a reentry vehicle going to work? I mean, a new issue is North Korea and Iran cooperating on reentry vehicle work? Iran can do tests. North Korea is very limited in shooting off a missile with a reentry vehicle and trying to study the results. So, I mean, we still don't know. And I worry that we just kind of lapse into, well, let's give them credit. Let's give them credit. I mean, I think in previous cases, that's a dangerous road to tread. I know it's a natural road, but it's a dangerous road to tread.
Yes. Well, let's hope for more parades, David, right?
And more visits.
Next is David Anhalt. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Dr. Albright, I am a little bit new to this, but I captured some thoughts about the comparison of the nuclear fuel cycles for both Taiwan and Iran. And so from what I understood from your remarks, Taiwan chose to go the route of plutonium in their program back in the 80s. But as you stated, Iran felt that a plutonium fissile material was the too onerous a route to take, and it would take them another 10 years to get there. So my question, from the standpoint of nuclear proliferation, why do some choose plutonium and don't see that as an issue? And why did Iran think that plutonium was a bridge too far?
Fundamentally, it's what type of research reactor they managed to acquire or build. Taiwan got a nice research reactor from Canada back in the days when these things weren't controlled. It's the same type that India got and produced plutonium in for its first nuclear explosion in 1974. It was so-called peaceful, but it makes very nice weapon-grade plutonium. And so for Taiwan, they had that reactor, and it was just a question of adding a reprocessing capability. Non-trivial, but very doable for Taiwan. And they received a lot of help. They had several of their scientists were trained at the premier French reprocessing plutonium entities in France and back in the 1970s. And so again, a different era. Iran was struggling to build a research reactor, and by the early 2000s hadn't even started construction, but they were far along on developing gas centrifuges. And so a lot of it is just countries have to get this capability to make nuclear explosive material, and there's resistance to providing it. And so it's just a question of what they get. But in the end, they always think about the other pathways too. And so Pakistan got centrifuges, didn't give up on plutonium, finally was able to pursue plutonium years later. And Iran, I think, figured it would do plutonium or will do plutonium later.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, David. Mohammed Al-Mihrabi asks, first, he thanks you for the information. He's heard it argued that the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA allowed Iran a legal path within the condition of that agreement to gradually accelerate its nuclear program. The idea seems to be that Iran's JCPOA obligations became fewer if the other signatories fail to uphold their responsibilities under the agreement. Could you explain what in that argument is correct or not correct?
Yeah, and again, it's one of the frustrations of the language in the JCPOA. The statement that Iran makes that it could end its limitations under the JCPOA is true, but so is the statement that Iran is violating the JCPOA. And so you have a situation where it's up to each participant to decide this question. And this ultimately gets to snapback. The snapback mechanism can be invoked by any member or any participant of the JCPOA. And once they invoke it, nothing can stop them from reaching the Security Council and snapping back inspections. And the language to justify snapback on the part of the US, or anybody, not Iran, but of the other parties, is sort of Iran doesn't have a political commitment to this agreement anymore. It's not even, it's a very vague condition that, in fact, the US could have invoked it easily in May of 2018. And the question that I still don't know the answer to is why didn't they? Why didn't they do it then? Why did they wait and have to do it in this kind of, I don't know what to call it, this, I don't want to call it an odd way, but a way that's going to generate a lot of opposition. In 2018, if they'd done it, they could have used the nuclear archive. That would have been sufficient under the language of the JCPOA to justify a complete snapback of sanctions. And I don't think the UE3 could have said much about that, given they were shocked by this too, by this revelation. Certainly China and Russia would object, but nothing could stop the US at that point. So again, I think these kinds of things have to be resolved in any future negotiation. What does it mean to violate? And how do you set up a mechanism to deal with the violation short of snapback?
David, we have a question about Saudi Arabia, how Iran's current path and the situation with JCPOA is affecting their calculus, and what should the US be doing to respond to things that Saudi Arabia may be thinking in terms of its own nuclear program?
Well, one is, I think the United States has to stick to this idea of no enrichment, no reprocessing, and it's just too dangerous in that part of the world. And the US has this gold standard that the UAE's accepted. The effort should be to ensure that Saudi Arabia accepts it. Saudi Arabia can legitimately respond. If Iran doesn't accept it, why should we? And I must say, part of my motivation to go to the no enrichment in Iran is with an eye to Saudi Arabia, that we need agreements that reduce the dangers posed by nuclear programs in the region. Now, in terms of the logistics, where is Saudi Arabia? They don't have much of a nuclear program. And the biggest worry is they're going to buy something. They bought pretty dangerous missiles from China. Are there other missiles they've acquired we really don't know about, using their connection in Pakistan, for example? Could they buy a gas centrifuge plant from Pakistan? It has a very robust program. It would certainly come under safeguards of the IAEA, but so is Iran's centrifuge program is under safeguards. So for Saudi Arabia, the fear is more of what they'll buy. There's been some very interesting reporting in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about some covert activities or quasi-covert facilities in the early part of the fuel cycle that we're trying to get to the bottom of. And we're hoping the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times will do follow-on reporting of facilities associated with mining and milling uranium and facilities for processing that a little further along the fuel cycle chain, called a uranium conversion facility.
Yeah. Okay, David, I think we have time for one more, and I'm going to end with a semi-provocative question for you. I think you can handle this. From Grant Christopher. Do you know of any country that has given up its nuclear program that faces the same conditions that Iran has, which is no nuclear guarantor against a hostile superpower and the prospect of regional conflict? Do you know of any country that hasn't embarked on a serious nuclear program under the condition that Iran faces? He's not trying to.
I don't know. One can argue Iraq, and which tells you something of what may be required in Iran's, but although I don't personally think that's necessary. Another is Taiwan. I mean, while Taiwan's effort to get nuclear weapons was a direct repudiation of and disbelief that the United States would respond in time. And it was very worried internally, and you see it in the documentation of some of the people involved in this that have revealed over the course of time, that they weren't sure they could count on the United States. With the United States, and it's the old calculations, the United States is going to risk Seattle to save Taipei. And so they wanted some assurance. The US managed to get them to give it up. And there again, the United States had tremendous leverage. But let's go back to Iran. Iran is vulnerable to international pressure. And that's, frankly, Taiwan was just pressed very harshly. Because they had to make a choice between military aid, forget the security, military aid, which would allow them to defend themselves, and a nuclear weapons program. Iran has to make a choice under international pressure. Does it want to rejoin the international community or be on sort of the renegade side of things? And we don't know that. So again, I would argue that there are examples of each of these issues that the questioner raised in other countries. Iran is a rather unique case, and their security concerns are going to have to be addressed, which also argues another thing that Trump administration has pushed. I'm not that involved in it, but that there has to be, the regional issues do have to be brought into this. Certainly the French and the other Europeans would support this, but what's going on in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen does matter. And we don't, and if there is going to be a Cold War in the Middle East between certain Arab states and Iran and its allied Arab states, that Cold War is going to have to somehow be ended.
Well, David Albright, we've come to the end of our forum. It's been a superb discussion of incredibly important issues ahead of us that seem to complicate as the months go by. Thanks again for your participation. We hope to see you again soon. To you and to our audience, and from all of us here at Mitchell Institute, have a great Aerospace Power Day.